Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for making the time to join us today. My name's Nicola Watkinson. I'm the Managing Director of International here at the City UK, and I'm really pleased to have a lovely and fantastically informed group of people to join me for this member briefing. And I have to say, it's a happy day for me, for the fact that so many of you have decided to join the briefing today is a real indication that we are starting to appreciate that issues like geopolitical risk, economic protectionism, and growing barriers to trade and investment are things that are going to become absolutely core to the way in which we think about our businesses going forward. It's a time when I feel quite torn because, having spent my career in this area, it's very, very nice to be wanted and to have a skill set that feels very relevant today. But it also is due to the fact that we're facing a lot more uncertainty, a lot more volatility in the global operating environment, and much more intervention from governments around issues to do with security and defence, bleeding into the work that we do in terms of commerce and trade. But it's a perfect time to have reflected on our international strategy. And those of you who've been with us over the last couple of years on this journey will know that we launched the international strategy in September 2021. And in that time, I'm pleased to say that we've had some really nice wins coming out of the work that we've been doing. We've seen some good wins on mobility, business mobility, including some changes to business visitor definitions, and we're hoping for the next round of wins coming out in the autumn statement. We've seen some refinements to the NSI Act that we've worked on very hard to make that clearer and simpler. We've seen some changes to the foreign influence registration scheme, which we worked on very closely with our legal services team. We've made a lot of input to the Harrington Review on investment attraction and how to make the UK more competitive for international investment. And we're hoping for some announcements in the autumn statement around that. We've done work on outward investment and the new executive order coming from the US, and just had the Assistant Treasurer Paul Rosen come through to talk to our group about that. We've managed to secure an extension to the WTO e-commerce moratorium, and we to at least March next year, and we're working hard to continue on those issues. And we've also had our principles to FTAs adopted by DBT, including what should go into all digital chapters into the future. So we are finding that we've had some good wins. But what we're here to do today is to reflect on what we've learned from the last 2 years, and also to look forward to see what we might need to do into the future. And the best way for me to do that is to pass over to Edward Braham. So Edward Braham would be known to many of you as the chair of MNG. He was also formerly the senior partner at Freshfields and is a very well-known M&A lawyer. But for me, his most important role is as the chair of the International Trade and Investment Group, where he leads our work on the international strategy. And I have to say that he has brought a huge amount of ambition, focus, purpose, and momentum to our work. So it's very fitting that I pass over to him to talk about the work we've been doing on the international strategy review. Edward, over to you.
Thank you, Nikki. You flatter. I can assure you we would not be where we are if it wasn't for Nikki and Stephen and the team over time, because we have achieved a lot, I think. So if we step back 2 years, September 21, you'll remember that we published the international strategy that Nikki mentioned. That came about, it wasn't really a consultation, it went way beyond that. There were incredibly extensive conversations across industry, with regulators, with government, and what we published brought all that together in a way which landed very positively, because it actually reflected what the core issues were, and a plan which was both ambitious but also very well targeted. The headline goal was deliberately ambitious, to make the UK the leading international financial centre by 2026, so 5 years later. It was anchored around 3 key areas of focus. First was competitiveness of the UK, Second was growing the UK share of the global financial and related professional services market. And the third was focusing on future growth opportunities. So just digging into that slightly. Competitiveness, we identified the need to attract global talent. I'll come back to the importance of the ecosystem, but being a hub for global talent is a really important element of that. Boosting inward investment and adopting a dynamic and agile approach to regulation. Second piece of growing the UK share of the global financial and related professional services market was the sort of things Nikki was just touching on there. It's about working on liberalising trade, including regulatory agreements that support services trade, and securing recognition of qualifications and improving talent mobility. And the third piece about future markets, the thought process was what we have, what goes through Brexit goes, but actually the real key is what you win in the future. And we identified 4 key areas, which I think remain valid and have served to anchor a lot of what we do. The first was data and technology. The second was sustainability. The third, global investment. So the UK as a hub for global investment. And the fourth was risk management. And as Stephen will talk to later, we're now stepping back to see what we've done and where we go from here. So Nikki spoke about a lot of achievements, things which she didn't touch on was winning government support for intra-company transfers to make that visa process better. That's not quite landed, but we're hopeful it will be soon. A lot of improvements that matter to international investors. So Nikki said guidance on the NSI scheme, taking the industry out of FIRS and so on. On digital, the important forward-looking piece that Nikki mentioned, but we had significant influence on the Australian FTA, the Singapore Digital Economy Agreement, and the US Data Bridge. Switzerland, which is a really important market, we've had a key role in supporting the negotiations on the MRA and the FTA, and we were quite vocal on the need to roll over the mobility agreement, which has been done, which is great. And we represent the industry on the domestic advisory group as the UK prepares for the renegotiation in 2026 of the cooperation agreement. So it hasn't all been plain sailing by any stretch. So things like the sanctions regime for Russia have been quite some challenge for everyone. Did a lot to try and help that process through. And we're very focused on some of the big opportunities. And an example of that is Saudi Arabia, where we led a delegation to Saudi, and we've hosted the Saudi Central Bank back here. So if you step back, where does that leave us? I've always felt that the UK's strength lies in the overall ecosystem. We have the full range of financial related professional services at the very top level. We're still attracting top talent. We have strong underpinnings from the legal and the regulatory system. And it makes that an inherently attractive market. We need to work to make it better, because you can always make things better, but we should recognise the fantastic strength of what we do have. Investment in tech dipped a bit, but has rebounded strongly. We have the largest asset management centre outside the US. What's the challenge? It's that everyone else wants one too. So maintaining global share is going to require a lot of work. Green finance, very important to the future, but our green bond issuance is well down against some other markets. So we've got work to do there. And we need to be very alert to geopolitics, because there are opportunities there, but also we need to be conscious of what others are doing. So The EU is very clear that it wants to build its own capabilities in a number of important areas. There's economic gravity shifting to China, to the Middle East, and to ASEAN. I think I'd see that as opportunity, real opportunity. And the US is pursuing a number of important policies, but I'd pick out particularly the tech capabilities in chips and net zero. So Linda is going to talk about how the world is changing. And as I said, Stephen will reflect on what that means for us going forward. But I think it's fair to say that the 2021 strategy has served us well, and we have a lot to show for the work. So big thanks to Nikki and the team for everything they've done, because as I said at the beginning, it really would not have happened without them. And I think it's a fantastic time to reflect on where we are, to reprioritise and recommit to delivering valuable outcomes, because that's really what it's all about. So Nikki, back over to you.
Thanks, Edward. And I think that's a great way to move to Linda. So I think what we did find through our review was there was a number of things that have remained the same, as you said, about needing to support the full service ecosystem that we have. But what we did, of course, discover that there's been a lot of change even in 2 years. And a lot of that has been at the geopolitical and geoeconomic level. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Linda Yueh, who's going to share her thoughts on some of this. So Linda is, of course, a leading economist. She's a fellow of economics at St Edmund Hall in Oxford. She's an adjunct professor of economics at the London Business School. And of course, she's a well-known author. And we were talking just before we came online about her latest book called The Great Crashes. So if you want some light, entertaining reading, please do go and get that. It's got a lot of, I think, interesting messages there about what may be coming our way in the next couple of years, or at least the potential. But Linda, you're a great expert on geopolitics and geoeconomics. Would you like to take us through some of the things you're seeing that are starting to impact on our future strategy, please?
Thank you very much, Nikki. And let me just add my praise put in. I think this is hugely important to think about how the UK should position itself, and the progress that's already been made. So your engagement is very, very welcome. So that's actually going to be the second part of my comments, but the first part is I'm going to spend just a few moments on I would say, where geopolitics affects economics, where it matters, the kind of so what question in terms of the global trade and investment scene, which has changed a lot even over the past year. And then I'll add a few thoughts around the UK and where the UK should think about how to optimize its own position and contribute to the global system during these times. So the first question is, we hear a lot about geoeconomics now. So that is literally geopolitics and economics, because we are certainly in an era where previously you might think supply chains were commercial decisions that didn't have a risk overlay. But these days, because of this era of great power competition, as well as 2 wars, we seem to all be operating in a global trade and investment system, which has a risk overlay. So 2 concrete areas where you can see it really beginning to affect business. I'll start with sustainability and metals. So global public goods like health and education, very important, as we've learned over the last few years. But where geoeconomics is impacting supply chains, it's now spreading into this area, particularly around battery metals and electric vehicles. So if you think about the pandemic affecting supply chains and supply chain resilience and stress testing being discussed by the G7, and then we had the chip wars, which at its base is about global competition between the economic superpowers. And now I think the next phase of it is we shouldn't be surprised because tech standards was part of this as well. And now we've moved into another area, which is we hear a lot about energy resilience. We hear a lot about whose standards for the next era of tech. But it's also hitting an area which is crucial for the green transition, which is battery metals. If you want to store renewable energy, you're going to power electric vehicles, then having battery metals like nickel, like phosphate, like lithium are important. And it's not just where these minerals are located, it's also the processing of these minerals. So as geoeconomics starts to layer onto this area, I think the US's Inflation Reduction Act, the EU's Green Deal is all trying to gain some degree of competitiveness. But by current projections, that even if the US and the EU achieve their aims in terms of EV production, in terms of battery production, some 80% of the assembly of batteries is still going to be done in China by 2030. So this means that even the green transition is subject to this layer of geoeconomics and geopolitics. And I use this as an example, but it won't be the last frontier. And I think this does mean we need to think about a world which is second best in terms of efficiency, but I think realistic in terms of thinking about what it means to have geoeconomics just as part of your regular risk assessment when you think about investment and when you think about supply chains. And the second area is around data. Obviously, generative AI has made a lot of headlines. The AI Safety Summit, the UK has just held. I'm actually going to use that as an example about UK positioning. So I chaired an LSE commission that looked at the UK's position in the 21st century. And one of the conclusions is when you are in an era of great power competition, being a neutral broker has its advantages because if you look at for instance, the head of the WTO, the US proposes a candidate, China says no, China didn't even propose a candidate because the US would say no. So there is space for countries like the UK to play this role of honest broker, especially around things like tech standards. And the AI Safety Summit that was just held, it was hailed by no less than Elon Musk as an important event in terms of AI. But nearly at the same time, the US announced its own AI Institute, which is going to be at the frontier cutting edge. And the Americans said very clearly they will be setting the standards. And this is why the positioning makes sense. However, the execution of it is very challenging in an area like data, which is going to dominate a lot of trade and investment in the coming years because countries all want to set their own standards. It's very unlikely they're going to step back, partly because of these great power competition I'm speaking of, but also partly because what we're talking about in terms of data standards is very linked to domestic economy. So I'll give you a gross generalization, which was told to me by a data expert, which is in China, the government owns your data. In the US, companies own your data. In Europe, we own our data. So reconciling domestic standards makes it very hard because every country wants its own standards to be the basis for developing this area of AI and then all the other uses of data, which is, as I say, defining the fastest growing areas of global trade. So global trade in goods plateaued a few years ago, but digital trade, services trade, this is growing quickly, and that is powered increasingly by data. So does that mean that the UK positioning needs to be rethought? I would say yes and no, because what the UK attempted to do was very much based on bringing stakeholders like businesses and governments together. US and China were both at Bletchley Park. And that is an important part of the effort, but that's not the only important way of trying to forge a multilateral type of system, given these differences. So what I'm specifically referring to is the breakthroughs that we have seen over the past couple of years haven't come through single country efforts. It's come through plurilateral efforts. And that is what the UK was trying to do at the AI Safety Summit. It was bringing in countries to get buy-in, and that's why they did issue an important communique. And that is the essence of plurilateralism, even if it succeeds more or less at various points. Plurilateral is less than multilateral, which is not all countries, but it's a group of countries which share an interest in coming up with a common norm, understanding, global basis for operating important parts of trade and investment. And the recent breakthrough at the World Trade Organization around services liberalization, updating GATS, which was the basis for services trade in the same way that GATT was the basis for goods trade, that came about through a plurilateral effort that the UK was a part of. So in the end, it became a WTO breakthrough because the plurilateral effort brought in enough support from other countries around, as I say, opening up global services trade, which is important for all countries. And I think it was recognized by the US and by China, who both came into the discussions, which allowed the WTO breakthrough to happen because the two major powers were there. So how was it achieved? It was achieved because of a recognition that when you have enough of a critical mass, then you want to be part of that policy making. And that's when America and the Chinese came to the table. And indeed, they probably know the old adage, which is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so to me, that is actually a great example. And data, of course, as we heard, is e-commerce. This is now also the next stage of trying to use a plurilateral effort to make progress in key areas. And the UK can play a leading role in that because this is exactly the time when a country that's not the US and China could actually provide leadership. And by the same reasoning, if you are at the table, if you are leading the effort, then the standards, the norms, the rules that you're formulating with your own business and stakeholders, that is very important for your own country's competitiveness. So to me, that's what I would suggest the UK position itself in this era where geoeconomics affects trade and investment globally. And recent breakthroughs make me optimistic that plurilateral efforts can make significant headway despite the geoeconomics that pervade the global trading system. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Nikki and look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thanks, Linda. That's absolutely brilliant. And without any rehearsal, I can say one of the strong themes that came through in the review of the 2-year strategy was this role that the UK is going to need to start playing as a convener. We don't have this huge economic hinterland behind us anymore, but what we do have is a strong reputation in the global operating environment around financial services. We're seen as a credible and more neutral hub. We've got a strong historical tradition of funding global growth around the world, right from the time, if you're a historian like me, of the railways systems in the US and so on. We've got the talent. People still want to come and be based in the UK. It's a place you can attract talent and retain it. It's got that innovative product and service development capability. And it does have a global outlook, which perhaps differentiates it from some large markets like, the US and China that tend to be quite domestically focused in many ways. So I think, there is the basis there of kind of taking that strength and thinking about how does the UK convert that into a new role for itself in the on the global stage, and that sounds like where you've been directing your thinking too. So I think it's great to see that alignment, and it does play out to the points you made around data, sustainable finance or sustainability, investment and risk, which are the four themes of our strategy. So thank you very much. And I'll come back in a moment for some questions, because I'm sure many people will have them. But for now, what I would like to do is to invite Stephen Booth to perhaps outline where we think the strategy is going to go over the next couple of years. What are some of the forward actions that we're looking to take on the back of the feedback we've received? And invite you to offer your comments and thoughts and ideas for how we can engage with you as we move forward. So for those of you who've not yet met Stephen, he joined us, I think, about 3 or 4 months ago now. It feels longer because he's been working so fast and so hard. He comes from a background in Westminster and in a number of think tanks, and we're delighted to have him on the team. So Stephen, over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much, Nikki, and very interesting to hear Linda's viewpoints. And I think a lot of what I will say will hopefully flow from the kind of the issues that she's raised. I think first thing to say is, in terms of the strategy going forward, we will continue to work on many of the issues that Edward and Nikki touched on. So that's continuing to bang the drum for a sort of a relatively free flow of talent into the UK, trying to address any of the frictions that firms experience in terms of moving people in and out of the UK. Secondly, ensuring that the UK retains its compelling offer to international investors. And I think this is an area where the changing geopolitical environment is clearly having an impact. We've seen that through the National Security and Investment Act, but we're also now seeing it in the US proposals for outward investment screening, and the UK potentially following suit in some way. But I think what came through in our conversations around the 2-year review were how to reflect some of these geostrategic and geopolitical trends in our future work. And I think bringing together what Edward and Linda have already said, I think one of the areas I think we're quite keen to move forward is around building on this theme of the UK being a convener and a sort of networked power, is identifying what the UK offers both bilateral partners, but also in partnership with others in terms of furthering the agenda around certain issues. So this might mean working with markets such as the Japanese, Singaporeans, and so on, or the Swiss, on policies which we want to pursue in multilateral forums or plurilateral forums. I mean, there's a recent example of the regulators in those jurisdictions working on innovation around digital assets, for example. And that's an example where we might work with those jurisdictions to further common interests. On the other hand, on the other side of the coin, we're also focused on, as I said, the UK's own competitiveness. So one area of work we want to look at is when the government starts to implement the regime around the competitiveness objective for the regulators, is benchmarking that against other jurisdictions. So looking at how governments and stakeholders hold regulators to account against those objectives in other jurisdictions, and seeing what comparisons can be made in terms of how the UK regulators perform under that mandate. Another area of work, I think, which will be increasingly important and reflects the geopolitical trend towards growing protectionism, friendshoring, greater regionalisation of trade, is there's probably a movement away from the big blockbuster free trade agreements we've been used to. The UK obviously has been very active post-Brexit in rolling over agreements and doing some certain new agreements, but we are seeing a fatigue. We've seen it in the US, we're seeing it in the EU in terms of negotiating these big agreements. So looking at what we might do that's sort of smaller scale, sector specific, issue specific, but can still further the priorities of the industry. So particularly around digital data, financing the transition, those kind of issues where sector specific or issue specific agreements might be able to further the agenda, which we can't do through a big blockbuster agreement. And another area I think that is worth mentioning is with a sort of thawing in UK-EU relations post-agreement of the Windsor Framework regards Northern Ireland, is there an opportunity to have a more constructive dialogue with our European partners, with a view to the TCA review, as Edward mentioned, coming into sight in a few years' time? I think there is a need to provide a sort of broader strategic context for that discussion, identifying the areas of common interest. And I think you can see those being a shared demographic challenge, a shared need to finance the green transition, a shared concern about the economic resilience of Europe. And I think identifying where our industry, and I think our industry has a lot to say about providing solutions in those areas, identifying a shared agenda there with our European partners might help to unlock some of the knottier issues and problems that we have faced throughout sort of implementation of the TCA agreement and the negotiations that led to it. So that gives you a kind of a flavour of some of the projects we have in mind, and obviously we're very happy to answer questions from anyone who has them. So with that, I'd like to pass back to Nikki.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And if I can ask the other members of the Linda and Edward to come back on screen too, and we'd be delighted to take any questions from people or any comments or observations. So please do pop something into the chat if you would like to pose a question to us, or if you'd like to raise your hand. Our host, Charlie, may be able to spot you and bring you into the conversation. I'm going to start off, if you don't mind, with just one question, and maybe Linda, this is to you, because it's one I've been thinking about, and that is, next year is the year of elections. We've got the election here in the UK, we've got one in the US, we've got some in the EU, in India, in Indonesia. I could keep going. Just about everywhere around the world that we've got democratic governments, we have an election going forward. The question that many people are asking is, does that put us into a year of paralysis, or as we wait to see how that pans out? What's your thinking around what can still be done by business, perhaps, over this period?
Yeah, thanks very much, Nikki. So I suppose I have a couple of takes on the year of elections. I mean, one is, would elections in Taiwan, which has happened earlier in the year, could that tip the status quo? Because obviously that's another point of geopolitics, which could be a stress point in terms of relations with China. Of course, the UK also has elections, but the one I think that lots of will matter a great deal in the great power competition era is, of course, the US election. So whether it's President Trump again, whether it's President Biden, whether it's their new candidates, I think the Republicans and Democrats agree on very little, but they do agree in terms of competing against China. So I think that the stance of the US and of isn't likely going to shift very much. So that leaves nicely to your question around, should we expect much policy shift in a year of election? Actually, as you and I briefly discussed, quite a lot of policy is set by, the kind of the aims are set by the politicians, but the strategy, the execution, the delivery is actually set by the institution. So it's not just the civil servants, it's the regulators, the central banks have their mandates. There's quite a lot which is, in train in these countries. So I actually think that even though we will have lots of elections next year, I mentioned a couple which of course has great potential to shift things. But I actually think it is a great opportunity in many ways for businesses to engage policymakers, because business as usual, despite the elections, life must go on. And there's always a slight concern that a new administration comes in and throws everything out that the last administration did. You can never rule that out. But again, most countries with democratic institutions, also appreciate the value of policy continuity. So that's what I'm keeping my fingers crossed for in a year of elections.
No, thank you. And look, I have to say, having been in government, we were always quite grateful when there were times when elections were on, because it did allow us to sort of crack on with a whole lot of work without being distracted by the need to service, ministers' particular interests. So, and I think it is also a time when you can stand back and do some real thinking about what a forward manifesto might look like, what you would really like to achieve, and be a little bit sort of take a longer term view of some of these points. So I'm with you. I'm hopeful that the year of election will actually be quite a good one for business. I've got just a comment here from Nick Tolchard. So Nick, thank you for joining. Sort of talking about the support role of the UK as a convener. And also via the credibility to promote good governance practice in developing markets to help them to attract investment, which can then in turn help to mitigate demographic trends and potential migration pressures. So a bit of a question on how the City UK is engaging across the world, I guess, on these issues, as well as with the politicians here in the UK. So I might pick that up, Nick, because I think it is a fantastic question, and it's one of the areas where the City UK has probably been doing a little bit more over the last couple of years. And I hope many of you have met Anna Rogers, who is the head of our international development work. And with Anna's help, we've really been working alongside FCDO to really look at the soft power that the financial services actually brings to the UK. We are probably one of its best known assets, and one that does have a lot of international credentials. And so where we can, working alongside members to sort of crowd in their expertise in particular topics, and then work with FCDO as part of a bilateral or plurilateral engagement with different markets to be able to offer support for these countries as they look to stabilise and enhance their own financial centres. So we've done some work this year with Nigeria, helping them to look at how they need to disentangle a lot of their legislative frameworks in order to allow the fintech ecosystem to have a clear forward pathway to grow into. We've been working with Vietnam on the establishment of a regional financial centre for them. And we're hoping to be able to do some quite significant work with Ukraine, helping Kyiv to look at how it can address some of the governance issues that it needs to address in order to bring in new international investment and have the right kind of policy frameworks in place to support an international financial centre in Kyiv. So those are areas where we are working and certainly actively engaging with ministers, whether it's ministers like Andrew Mitchell, who's one of the ministers for international development in Africa, or other ministers really across both the sort of trade and investment portfolio, the Treasury and the FCDO, because we see this as a cross-Whitehall area of importance for our future growth. So Nick, thank you for that question. I'm conscious of the time, so we probably really need to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. But I'm wondering, Edward, is there any final comments you would like to make before we allow people to move on to their next activity?
Well, that's an invitation to be brief. So two quick points. The first is to reiterate my thanks earlier, Nikki, to you, to the team, and I see Richard Hill's on. Richard was absolutely instrumental in the work to bring the strategy together when it was first done, and a critical part of the team. So again, thank you to all of you for that. So the second thing is, I think a lot of the success that ITIC has had has actually been because of the way in which everyone has lent into the topic. We have very lively meetings, and the views and the knowledge brought to the table really does change the way that things happen. So please continue to do that. Please continue to engage offline as well. This is very much our collective project, and unlike some efforts, this one is ultimately we judge ourselves by what we achieve, and what we achieve is so critically dependent on what you all do. So thank you to everyone for that.
Thanks, Edward, and I can only echo that. If you would like to be involved in any of our work, please do get in touch. I think this is a time when geoeconomics, geopolitics is going to absolutely be at the core of people's business strategy for their growth, both here in the UK in terms of how the rest of the world is going to start impacting on the UK, but also as you think outwardly. So we would love to work with you and love to hear more about your thoughts over time. So many thanks, Linda, for your time and effort and for your ongoing support and strategic advice. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. We look forward to working with you in the year to come.